Hello, everybody. My name is Ray. Welcome to the Evangelical Dark Web. Today, we'll be diving into the TGC Talks, which is the Gospel Coalition's TED Talks, I guess. That's what they're trying to do now. And it's given by Justin Giboney, or Giboney. And he is one of the people behind the AND campaign. And I've talked about the AND campaign quite a bit, actually. They're this social justice political advocacy group that they promote their version of the Equality Act. They pretty much promote bribing women to not kill their own children. That's their stance on abortion, and they promote open borders and stuff like that. So they're not a very biblical group, and they champion social justice. I've done videos and articles on this in the past, but we're going to dive right into this TED Talk where Justin Giboney is supposedly going to tell us all the lies we keep telling ourselves about critical race theory. So without further ado, let's roll tape.
We all hate the lies that falsely accuse us or misrepresent our intentions. We're rightfully indignant when others bear false witness at our expense or at the expense of
Right.
those who we deem worthy of our compassion. But what about the lies that serve our purposes? What about the false narratives that absolve us, the cultural myths that glorify us, and the mischaracterizations that obstruct our opposition? My question is, what do we do with the lies that are useful? The lies that artificially boost what we consider to be a good cause. Lies can come in many different forms: intellectual dishonesty, pretext, conflation,
Wow,
overly
this
broad
really is a
labels,
TED
straw
Talk.
man arguments, etc. And unfortunately,
I'm listening to this for the first time, by the way, so I'm reacting in real time. And wow, this really is a TED Talk. This takes me back to days of college, community college, where they did TED Talks all the time in class.
the American church's ongoing debate about racial justice is full of all variety of lies, especially the lies that serve those who would rather not talk about the subject at all. Let's be honest. We're all expected to lie to protect certain cultural narratives. Refusing to promote the myths that glorify our ethnic or ideological identity is considered disloyal. So, what do we do?
That may be more true for black people than it is for white people, because white people don't really recognize there is no unified white identity. And usually when people try to say that there is, they're really just conflating it with Americana, American culture, things that are extremely American, like guns, for instance, is extremely white culture, even though black people are into guns too. I know black people are into guns that live in Baltimore, so they don't just live out in the suburbs. Or so that's one of those myths. Music, I guess country music's more uniquely American. Rock music, actually, those Central European nations love heavy metal, but that's I guess pretty white. I don't know, but there's not really what is a unified white culture? It doesn't exist. And at best you could say it's American culture. And um at most unified, but I don't think there really exists a white culture in the United States. We're just too split up. There is a massive chasm between white woke liberals and white conservatives. They don't have the same culture. They don't. They don't. I think that the white Christian evangelical has more in common with a black person, culturally speaking, than they do a woke leftist. And, that's what I believe. They don't believe in political correctness, and They both generally like more Second Amendment than the woke whiteys. There's not a unified white culture. But I do think there is certain expectations among black people that they kind of like hold to themselves. Like if you deviate from the pack, you're called an Uncle Tom or something like that, and that's really wrong. And you see a lot of white leftists really champion those labels as well. So we'll see where he's going with this.
We pretend. Some conservatives pretend that Christians lived in a moral golden age before the liberals took over. Some progressives pretend that whiteness is responsible for almost all sins and pathologies, and those things might be flattering.
That's not true of either of those things. Like, I don't know when you would put a golden age on American Christianity because, a lot of liberals took over late 19th century, early 20th century. So I don't think enough people are really informed to make a general consensus on that issue. As for the leftist point, that's a lie too, because they don't just blame whiteness, they also blame masculinity, they also blame heteronormativity, they also blame, there's also fat phobia and skinny culture. They have a whole litany of things that they blame as oppressive classes, not just whiteness. Whiteness is just under critical race theory. That's just under critical race theory, which is just one arm or branch of critical theory, also known as cultural Marxism.
They're lies. There was no golden age of morality in a country that enslaved people and constantly used color as a reason to deny human dignity. And every culture has plenty of sins and pathologies of its own making, which doesn't deny the fact that majority culture is responsible for a lot of injustice and dysfunction. We should be able to acknowledge the brokenness in all of us without resorting to false equivalencies or suggesting that some people are responsible for their own oppression. The Bible shows us that promoting the lies that serve our purposes is nothing new. As is often the case, those with position and privilege rarely receive the reproach of those of lesser station with humility and grace. That's because power rooted in this world is usually very insecure and obsessed with self-preservation. By the time we get to Matthew 26, the religious leaders have resolved to kill Jesus, to rid themselves of this nuisance that was exposing their lies and undermining their authority. And verse 59 tells us that they're now looking for false evidence to prove that Jesus had been blaspheming. They would eventually find witnesses to corroborate the allegation that he planned to destroy the temple. Now, they didn't make this claim up out of nowhere, but they did twist his words and take them out of context. Small details, I guess, for such a serious crime. You see, the lies were convenient, and they served their purposes. They were presented perhaps in such a way that they could be rationalized by those claiming to still uphold the ninth commandment. Again, we see similar tactics in the debate about race in the church. Too many Christians...
He definitely totally misapplied the trial of Jesus. Because they do ask if he's the Messiah. And Jesus does give an answer to them. He doesn't give an answer to Herod. And Pilate really isn't really interested in sticking around to figure out what is truth. But there was at least a debate among the Sanhedrin. They obviously came to the wrong conclusion. And, that's the story. You guys should know that, hopefully.
Have resolved to maintain the position that all demands for racial justice are overblown. And they're willing to employ all manner of useful lies to bolster that argument. One way we do this is by romanticizing American history. acting like virulent racism was just a small blip in an otherwise pristine historical record, or pretending the explicit racism in our laws existed so long ago that it couldn't possibly still linger in our systems and institutions. Well, that's absurd. Might I remind you that Jim Crow and mass incarceration and redlining and black veterans' exclusion from the GI Bill all happened within the lifetime of some of the people watching now. The impacts of those things don't disappear just because the thought of them is something we don't like. Why is it that some Christians will actually become irate when you bring up verifiable facts about the history of race in America? I believe that it's because their pride can't process the truth.
He's trying to deconstruct American history, act like we romanticize American history, and to some degree, every culture kind of romanticizes their own history. That's just a fact of human nature. But if anything, Americans are really hammered in on slavery. Like that's like as far as like the only 20th century event taught in every American school is the Holocaust. Guarantee every American school will teach the Holocaust. Probably little to nothing else in the 20th century other than the Holocaust. As far as the 19th century goes, slavery, biggest emphasis in a history class will be slavery. So Americans are taught all about slavery. All about slavery. I don't know where he's getting this notion that people aren't taught. I mean, unless you want to argue that public schools are ineffective at teaching people actual history, I mean, that's an argument you can go down. But Americans are taught about slavery. That's for sure. And just for the record, abortion was America's system of abortion was far worse, is far worse than America's system of slavery ever was.
The truth is, America has some exceptional achievements and some exceptional transgressions.
No,
it reminds me of when the religious leaders just couldn't
what blemishes does America have that are really all that exceptional? Are again on the spectrum of how bad slavery can get. American slavery was not as bad as say Roman slavery. It probably wasn't as bad as like any of the other Atlantic slavery. After all, the Haitians rebelled. So, that's an instance of a very successful slave rebellion in the New World was the Haitian Revolt. American slaves never really rebelled. And you can argue it's because the South took proactive measures, and that's not untrue. But there are very few instances of anything beyond just a spree of murder in American history as it relates to slave rebellions. So, if you look at Roman history as another comparison, slave rebellions happen very frequently, especially before the fall of the Roman Republic. You had the servile rebellions in Sicily and all that. Spartacus, if you've ever heard that name, was like the third servile rebellion or something like that. So there was a lot. There's a long history of slave revolts in the history of humanity. It didn't quite happen in the United States. And it did happen in a lot of other places. Now, again, America, if you want to talk about Native Americans, that's just conquest. That, again, not unique to any culture in the history of mankind. America is unique in that we fought a war to end, or that resulted in the end of slavery. So we fought a war with a partial war goal of ending slavery. That's very unique about America. And aside from Mexico at the time, not many countries had banned slavery. England did it earlier, but that was just for England. That wasn't for the British Empire.
Handle hearing Peter reminding them about what they did to Jesus. They wanted to be lied to. When it serves us, we tell lies through...
Wait, did he just invoke Peter's sermon in Acts 2? Or is it Acts 3? actually, Peter giving that sermon led to a massive repentance, if I recall. So I'm not sure, these people wanted to be lied to. Actually, that's not really how it ended up happening. Those people actually were converted by the Holy Spirit. I don't know where he's getting that from.
Pretext, meaning we justify our actions by claiming good motives while concealing our real intentions. It's just, again, it's like the religious leaders claiming to be protecting the temple when they really just wanted to crucify Christ. That tactic has been used throughout history to deny justice. As you know, Reconstruction was a short period after the Civil War when our government attempted to reset a nation that had undergone a most necessary fracture. Booker T. Washington called it a time of storms and stress. But he also noted that it gave rise to brilliant political leaders in the newly enfranchised race. At the height of Reconstruction, around 2,000 African Americans held elected office, including in the United States Senate. Again, this was only a few years after emancipation. But these achievements would be short-lived because lies would prevail. Unreconstructed Confederates would begin to massacre black communities to prevent them from enjoying full citizenship. The southern states would paint even the federal government's most lackluster efforts to restore order as violations of states' rights. And federal troops would eventually withdraw almost completely. What an ingeniously evil ploy. Federal intervention to prevent slaughter was said to actually be an unlawful occupation, an un-American violation.
I mean, he invokes Booker T. Washington, but Booker T. Washington would not be supporting the ideas that he's advocating here. Just to point that out. Booker T. Washington was all about like hard work and educating yourself. If you've ever seen the movie Princess and the Frog, like the Disney movie, the princess movie, that movie is an embodiment of Booker T. Washington's ideas, which is why I'm surprised Disney made that movie.
Of federalism. Confederates would reclaim their land and reclaim their cause. And black representation was wiped out for decades because the Union chose a fraudulent unity over true justice, just as many are urging the church to do today. Reconstruction's end is an example of pretextual lies. It's also an example of reconciliation without a full reckoning. Reconciliation without a repentant spirit just doesn't work. Today, many are using the threat of Marxism as pretext to avoid reckoning with the church's race problem. They're conflating biblically sound pleas for justice with clear distortions.
No, what
Now,
biblically
to be clear,
sound pleas
Marxism
for justice?
does present a real threat to truth and moral order. But Marxism and critical theories aren't wrong for critiquing abuses of power and means of exploitation. The Bible does this.
Actually, they are wrong because they can find critiques in any situation, even in situations where it does not exist. It's non-falsifiable. That's why you cannot use critical race theory as an analytical tool. It is non-falsifiable. It can find racism in any situation. White people move in, it's gentrification. If white people move out, it's white flight. Both are racist. That's, just your classic example of non-falsifiability with critical race theory, which is a Marxist byproduct because it basically just takes the class elements of classical Marxism and rebrands it, reboots it for cultural identities. So you can't, and if he's going to compare Marxism to the Bible, which it seems like where he's going with this, that's even worse of a sign.
The same. They are, however, perilous and unbiblical, where they often tell lies to strengthen their arguments, where they essentialize our identities and spurn truth to flatten reality. The reality is one's race, class, or gender can often tell us something about their experiences, but it tells us nothing about
Intersectionality. That's intersectionality. The idea that because you're black, you have a certain experience, or that's also standpoint theory. So if you've ever heard of standpoint epistemology, the idea that if you're black versus if you're white, you would read the Bible with a different interpretation because of your own experiences.
their character or competence. Suggesting otherwise might make for a cleaner and easier argument, but it's a lie.
Prove it.
There are men who are honest, there are women who are honest, there are men who are dishonest, there are women who are dishonest. There are black leaders who represent their people with integrity and white leaders who represent their community with integrity. And there are folks on both ends that only represent their own ambition. And that takes nothing away from the importance of representation. But it is our reality in a broken world. The point is, our identities often tell us less than some critical theorists would have us believe. Still, not every mention of racial justice is Marxist or a promotion of critical race theory.
So which ones are and which ones aren't? Spell it out.
Conflate every demand for racial justice with the worst aspects of critical race theory is deceitful. To label everyone who's concerned with social justice as a Marxist is intellectually dishonest.
Social justice is and has always been a corrective form of justice. It's not actually justice. Social justice is when, say, in Marxism, you have the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, right? And you have injustices that result from that power dynamic. Social justice is when you take corrective action to basically wrong the bourgeoisie in favor of the proletariat to offset the system that they are facing. So in other words, things like reparations are social justice because they would steal from white people in theory. They would actually steal from black people and Hispanics as well. But their intention would be to steal from white people to give to black people. That is social justice. That's not justice. That's social justice. It's not just to steal in order to restore. That's not how this works. That's not how justice works. In the Bible, there's restitutions. But there are no people in America alive today that were African slaves. They don't have a case for receiving restitution.
It's a lie. It's a lie that's useful because it evades the true merits of the best arguments by centering the worst arguments. To center critical race theory in a conversation about race when black Christians have been fighting and weighing in on the subject for hundreds of years before critical race theory was even a thing is wickedly insincere. Don't simply argue against the disheveled postmodern academic who knows nothing about biblical justice. Argue against Christians like Frederick Douglass, Fannie Lou Hamer,
Seriously?
and Reverend William Augustus Jones, who coupled orthodoxy and orthopraxy, who stood 10 toes down on Scripture while living out their faith under the sword of oppression. And if you listen to them close enough, you'll realize that American racism has always done much of the work that you fear Marxism would do. It's undermined the family. It's undermined the church and turned it against itself. It's robbed people of their earnings, defiled women, violated religious freedom, and denied individual liberty. So when you don't get the response you expect from talking about Marxism, it's probably because we already know that racism has done the same thing. The idols that some Christians are protecting have already produced the outcomes they fear from Marxism.
This is why I wonder whether there's this black silent majority that here's all these people, all these race hustlers like Justin Giboney, and does not believe all this nonsense about how they're being kept down by the white man, because a lot of people are ready to move on from a racist past. They don't want to wallow in victimhood. But when you convince people that they can get something out of being a victim, they will become victims. They will embrace victimology. If you can convince them that there's a material benefit for being in a victim class, and that's what critical race theorists are all about doing. They convince white people that they're guilty of something because there's a lot of money to make in white guilt. There's so much money to make in white guilt. Robin DiAngelo is raking it in, convincing white people that they're guilty of sins they did not commit. That's why she's rich. That's why she is just a vacuum of money. But, you know, that does come at a cost. Like eventually they'll have to pay up to the people that really that are convinced by the victimology that they are entitled something. Eventually, if those people don't get any sort of rewards, it'll be like a Ponzi scheme. Eventually, they'll realize they're being played. I don't know how long that'll take, but the Ponzi scheme, this woke Ponzi scheme, will eventually collapse.
Some Christians are so worried about the Marxist barbarians at the gate that they've completely ignored the white nationalists who are already in the temple.
No, actually, the concern is the Marxists guarding the city that are going to let the culture, the Marxists outside the city, into the church. That is the comparison. Who are these white nationalists? What is white nationalism? Is it just being white and a nationalist? Or are you just trying to rebrand white supremacy as white nationalism because you can't get away with calling everyone a white supremacist? That's why they come up with this canard term, white nationalist, because they can't, the Overton window, they cannot get away with calling everyone a white supremacist. So they got to soften the term to white nationalist. They're trying to rebrand white nationalists as white supremacist.
If we're ever going to address the race problem faithfully, we must not only confront the lies that offend us, but also the lies that serve us. Because no lie can serve the church. Jesus, after all, was the truth. God bless you.
This video branded itself as being a middle ground, but it obviously was not a middle ground. He focused pretty much on attacking one side of the issue. Why? Because, Justin Giboney supports his version of the Equality Act. He supports bribing women to not kill their own children. And he's all about that open borders and definitely about racial reconciliation, whatever that is. Actually, as a Christian, I believe racial reconciliation was already accomplished by Christ on the cross. And the only way to get that in the culture is to preach the gospel. We can't expect a secular pagan culture to be racially reconciled when they're still living under the curse of the Tower of Babel and the separation of mankind. The fulfillment of undoing that, so to speak, is Jesus dying on the cross, where people of every tribe and every nation will be saved. That is the undoing of the Tower of Babel. Therefore, we cannot expect a pagan culture to be united, nor should we want a pagan culture to be united, because when mankind gets together under a banner of unity, it's never good. Unless God's involved, it's never, unless Christ is the center of it, it's never good. So, no unity with evil, and no unity with those who preach heterodoxy, like Justin Giboney. So, that's all I got to say about that. I was expecting a little bit more out of this video, but it is a nice chance to just, do some evergreen analysis on explaining critical race theory and social justice terms like that. And comment below what you think about what I think. Subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and also subscribe to evangelicaldarkweb.org, linked in the description below. And have a blessed day, and I'll catch you on the next one.